Hello, Year 10. Welcome back. We are moving on to our next poem today. Our idea this week is the idea of identity. And we have a slightly different key question, which is what should UK schools teach? And that's really relevant to today's poem, which is Checking Out My History by John Agard, where he is criticising and evaluating what should be taught and how that links to his identity. Okay, so let's have a quick think about identity, our idea today. It comes up a lot more often nowadays than I think it ever did. So, identity means sort of the fact of being who or what a person or thing is, it's the technical definition of it, and it can also mean something that has a close similarity or affinity. It comes actually from a Latin word ident, which also has other linked words to it like identical. So there's a lot about the same and seeing something where you see a lot of similarity in something. So all of you listening to this have an identity that is similar. You all identify as students at Y school. You have something in common that is the same. And that's sort of the idea we're looking at today. There's lots of things that identity can mean, so I want you to pause the video. I want you to have a quick think, just a minute or so. What can be part of your identity? What can make that? So, quick pause. Okay, so if you've had a little think about that, I've got a few ideas down here as well. Your identity can be a lot about sort of your upbringing, the values that you're taught, you're brought up by your family and your friends and your school. Your gender, that's something that comes up a lot. What type of gender do you identify as? Your religion or your faith, different causes you might have. So you might be really passionate about climate change. That is a cause, that is part of your identity. Passions, your sexuality, later on in life, your career and your aspirations, even your culture that you enjoy or that you're brought up in. Your nationality is part of your identity that is always part of everyone's identity. And education, like I've said, is something that you all have in common. And here you've got sort of an identity map that someone's created online. It's such a really wide and open idea in terms of what defines us as people and what we want to be defined of as a person. So that's what we're going to be looking at today in John Agard's poem. So we're going to have a look at John Agard. He is a modern poet. He is award-winning, has a huge amount of recognition, and he's originally from Guyanese, which used to be a former British colony and a slave plantation. It's just north of South America on the Caribbean coast. That's really important because the poem is addressing Agard's experience and it's really focusing on wanting the reader to look at the way education, especially history, is taught and how we conceive our identity as we learn about the culture, traditions, and different narratives that are told to us at a young age. So Agard's education was biased towards white and British history instead of actual living black history, which is more important and relevant for his own personal identity. And in his poem, he challenges this view of history and cites some major black figures to balance the bias and create a basis for his own identity. So I've got a short clip here, which actually from him himself, and he's talking about how he came about writing the poem, and then he also performs it in different sections. So when he performs in a really sort of very dramatic and really engaging fashion. It's almost more like a song than an actual reading of a poem. So that's when he's actually speaking the poem, and the rest is actually him explaining and going into more detail.
The first line in our history book, I seem to remember, was West Indian history begins in 1492 with the arrival of Columbus. It's that very Eurocentric view. Nothing exists until the European has entered the arena. The retelling of history depends a lot on who's telling the story. Them tell me what they want to tell me. bandage up my eye with my own history, blind me to my own identity. Them tell me about 1066 and all that. Them tell me about Dick Whittington and he cat. But to St. Louis, but you know, them never tell me about that. I would like to think that the poem has a celebratory side. It's celebrating characters such as Toussaint Louverture or Mary Seacole or the Amerindian past. But in a poem, you're not writing a history book. You're not writing a piece of journalism. So no matter how well-intentioned you might be, or how crucial the facts might be, that wouldn't make a poem. So it came out in that way, like a counterpoint of two voices. So one voice is the nursery rhymes, counterpointed by a celebration of historical characters. Them tell me about the man who discovered the balloon and the cow jump over the moon. Them tell me the dish run away with the spoon, but them never tell me about Nanny the maroon. When I think of Nanny, I'm thinking of like you're casting a spell. So I think from those words you get the feeling, how can I deliver this? This is a woman who used the traditions of her African ancestry. So that becomes a kind of a spell against an oppressive regime at the time. Nanny, seafar woman of mountain dream, fire woman, struggle, hopeful stream to freedom river. You can write a poem in Creole, but it might be a very reactionary poem. It might be very sexist. So it doesn't mean that writing a poem in Creole automatically means you're right on. But you're using all of your registers of speech, your linguistic heritage, and it gives a pride simultaneously in language, but also in history. Them tell me about Lord Nelson and Waterloo, but them never tell me about Shagga the Great Zulu. Them tell me about Columbus and 1492, but what happened to the Carib and the Arawak too? Let's say I'm playing with words the way you might play with musical notes. So a text becomes like a musical score. And sometimes the voice of delivery doesn't show itself until after the poem is written. Them tell me about Florence Nightingale and she lamp, and how Robin Hood used to camp. Them tell me old King Cole was a merry old soul, but them never tell me about Mary Seacole. The poet hopefully keeps us in touch with the vulnerable core of language that makes you what you are. It keeps you in touch with the heartfelt and vulnerable, fragile, complex, contradictory nature of the human beast. Them tell me what they want to tell me. But now I checking out me own history. I carving out me identity.
So, looking at the poem in more detail now, the whole poem is really criticising education, which was biased towards British white history. And throughout it, he uses colloquial language, as we said, but he actually has phonetic spelling. So, phonetic spelling is when you spell how it sounds of Creole dialect. So, the dialect that he grew up with and the language that he grew up with. So, we've got dem instead of them. And the repetition of dem throughout the poem really sets this separation of those people and us and me. I don't identify with dem. And throughout it, he is giving examples of what he's taught, such as Dick Whittington and his cat, and the Battle of 1066, this big British and white based history, and then comparing it with black history, which he wasn't taught but is important to him and his identity, such as Toussaint Louverture. Apologies, I'm not very good at French at pronouncing his name. But he is son of an African prince who was captured by slavers, and he actually led a successful slave revolt, which again is the idea of actually slaves sort of winning over the whites isn't the type of history that was written at that time. It was sort of whitewashed, you would say, and actually it's something that should be sort of, he's saying, brought back and made apparent, because actually he was as strong a leader as any of these British-based and these white-based historian leaders were. And then we also have this battle and conflict coming back into the poem with language such as battalion, which is a large body of troops ready for battle. So he's really setting up a conflict between two parties, between what he was taught and what he felt he should have been taught at school. So if you'd like to take a moment, just pause and get those first notes down in your poem. Moving on, we're going to have a quick look at the structure in this section of the poem. And the first thing I'm going to note is the anaphora, so that's a repeated phrase. Dem tell me is the repeated phrase. You can say just repetition, but anaphora is the technical structural word. And that gives it a real regular rhythm. It almost makes it song-like how John was performing it in the poem. It has this real rhythm going through it. Dem tell me about the man who discovered the balloon. And that sort of adds in with this regular rhyme scheme. We have balloon and spoon, moon, maroon, all the way through we've got these rhymes coming out at the end of the lines. And that creates a real nursery rhyme style of sound. So he's always making it like a song, like a nursery rhyme, sort of emphasizing the fact that he should have been taught this in nursery rhymes. He should have been taught this through his childhood, but it's not. Instead, you learn about fake things. You learn about silly stories like the moon that runs away with the spoon, and the cow that jumps over the spoon, and the dish runs away with the spoon. That's it. So he's really sort of almost mocking the idea that he's taught this and not about Nanny de Maroon, who was another leader of a successful slave revolt in Jamaica. So Maroon is the name of an escaped slave, someone that's not been technically allowed to leave. And they would form independent settlements, and because they did it sort of en masse, they were to all extents and purposes left alone. And she became known as Queen of the Maroons for leading this. So this really strong woman coming out and defending people and defending what's right. And it's also got lots of imagery with her as well. So the fact that she was a fire woman, she was hopeful stream to freedom river. It's really beautiful imagery of sort of hope and nature and power sort of coming through then as well. Then we have also Shaka the Great Zulu, who was a king of Zulu in a part of South Africa. So when the traders would come and take people from their land to become slaves, they didn't actually go into his region. He was such a strong, confident leader, so competent as well as a warrior, that they wouldn't go near his area. And so again, we have this comparison of Lord Nelson and his Battle of Waterloo, which is seen as like a great leader, a great powerful man, and comparison with Shaka the Great Zulu. It's almost making this point that Agard could learn the same about power and about leadership, but from his own identity. And then we have Caribs and the Arawaks, so those are tribal people native to Caribbean and South America. I really like the point he makes about the history book, which is so prevalent in America, that America started when it was colonized by Europe, by Columbus, and by the Dutch and the French and us. When actually, of course, it wasn't. There were Native Americans. They actually have, in South America, you actually have the most sophisticated ancient world as well, the Mayans. And so there's again this sort of overlooking and overshadowing of the history that's actually in that area and the history that belongs to his identity that should be taught. So if you want to pause the video and get down your annotations. So this final moment, again, he makes a comparison with really iconic white British figures that are taught in history, such as Florence Nightingale, who was famous for keeping the Crimean War, which happened sort of in the late Victorian era, keeping the soldiers really clean, and it's actually why we have the COVID hospitals named the Nightingale Hospital. It's in her memory. And of course, Robin Hood, who we know, and he compares them to Mary Seacole, who again can be seen as really almost the black version of Florence Nightingale, but isn't taught and is sort of forgotten about in history. So she was a Jamaican nurse who also fed the British soldiers during the Crimean War. Although she has exactly the same story, actually it's only Florence Nightingale that people talk about. So you can see there's this overlooking, and you could almost say this deleting, this removal of the history that Agard identifies with. And it also sort of has here, by comparing it, he's challenging the status quo and whitewashing of history. So he's challenging this idea that it's only Florence Nightingale you should learn about. It's not, you should learn about Mary Seacole as well. And then we have this final stanza and this final line when he says, I'm carving out me identity. So carving is a really sort of quite an aggressive verb, implying that he has to have a lot of hard work and persistence needed to build his identity because it's not there. And also carving, you could see, I think it's a really interesting word to end on, because it's the idea you carve into stone and that lasts a lot longer. So he wants to change history as well, or change the way we're taught today. So to summarise, Agard is criticising education which is biased towards British white history. So that he learned about mythical, sort of these nursery rhyme characters instead of living black people from the past. And that challenges this view of history and cites some major black figures to balance the bias and to create a basis for his own identity. I want to pause and we'll move on to our last couple of slides. I wanted to take a moment and consider a slightly different question, which is slightly less on English and a bit more wider onto why you are here right now. And that is, what should UK schools teach? Agard makes a really compelling poem about what he felt was important for him and what fed into his identity. He identified what was missing in his education, and his poem is very strong and almost a protest in itself to what he experienced and a sort of a fuel for change. And there's no better time, real better time, to consider that than there is now in what you're experiencing. If you think to your friends in year 11 and in year 13, their whole education was building up towards exams that actually in one day were told weren't going to happen, weren't important. And it's something that everyone experiences education, and everybody has a very powerful memory of it throughout the rest of their life. But it doesn't actually change that much. I was taught about 70% of the same amount of English that you were, though I was only a few years ago, and your other teachers and generations before that were taught pretty much the same texts and the same ideas, just maybe in a slightly different way. So you have to consider, why are we still learning that, which was taught, say, in the 40s and then the 50s, when actually the world those students were walking out into is not the same. So on that, I want you to think about sort of what will prepare you for an unknown future. We don't know what the future is. Last year's year 10s had no idea this is where their GCSEs and their time at Y, possibly even if they're not continuing at sixth form, would finish. And what do you think? What's part of your identity? Thinking back to what makes you tick, what creates you, and what do you feel passionate about? So what do you believe everyone should know? And then that sort of feeds back into this idea, like Agard was saying in his poem. So, how do you want your education to shape your identity? Maybe you feel really passionate about climate change, and there is talk of bringing in a new GCSE that will sort of be part of that. Maybe you are really passionate about different sides of history that have been forgotten. Maybe you're really passionate about really practical things that will help you in the future. So I want you to take a moment and really just jot down some ideas. What should UK schools teach? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it together and we can sort of make a little collage or a little poster and sort of create our ideal education. So if you like to just pause the video and just jot down your ideas. What, if you were designing a school today, what would you teach? Okay, so that's it from me this week. We've looked at Checking Out My History by John Agard. We've had a look at the context, the meaning, structure, message, and some reflections on education today. So I've just wanted to add this image in, which only just happened, and shows how passionate people feel about their identity and about what we're taught and history's role in that, and how we look after history, how we discuss history, which Agard makes so plain in his poem. So this is in Bristol. This is the statue of a slave trader, Colston, who left a lot of money to the city, and so there's a lot, such as his statue, such as even a hall that's named after him. But in the Black Lives Matter protest that happened over the weekend, the protesters ripped the statue down, which has been for years petitioned to be taken down, and threw him in the river, which is a really interesting and a really obviously passionate view of how actually change should happen and how Bristol doesn't identify, or certainly these people from Bristol don't identify with that anymore and want to change the narrative of history. So it's just a really interesting and really relevant way to look at the poem as well. This week's task, so you have your knowledge quiz. Well done to all of those who got 80 to 100%. We had some really fantastic results. Do have a couple of goes if you need to get through. And you're going to have, I want you to answer that question so I can put together a little, I don't know what will be yet, maybe a poster, maybe just a summary on what everyone thinks our UK schools should teach. You'll have a PETA as usual, and Mr. Rutland will add some tasks as well, which will be on the virtual lesson on Monday. That's our little summary. Well done, guys. I know you're working all really hard, so do keep well, keep safe, and any questions, do just let us know. See you next week.